morning, everybody. I'm going to keep this very brief, but it is my delight today to welcome back Stefanie Hillis for our first presentation of the day. Stefanie has been giving many Elwes talks over the years and was at our Norwich conference last year, so it's a real pleasure for her to open our Wednesday and our first full day of talks. Stefanie is the Arts and Humanities Librarian at Miami University, and I am going to switch over to her and get her slides up.
I think I am properly mic'd, yes.
We have many mics here. So.
We do have many mics. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to it. That was pretty great. So, hello everyone. As you just learned, my name is Stefanie Hillis and I'm the Arts and Humanities Librarian at Miami University in Ohio. And today I will be presenting Artificial Intelligence, Practical Lesson Plans and Theoretical Discussions on Art and AI. So in this presentation, I will discuss 5 lesson plans that use AI image generators as teaching tools. The first 3 are practical, fleshed out lesson plans that ask students to consider things like copyright and ethics, bias in image datasets, and how AI image generators use formal elements and principles of design. The final 2 lesson plans are less lesson plans than potential theoretical discussions. They ask students to examine how mediums like photography and conceptual art became accepted as art with a capital A, and then consider both how AI image generators extend these conversations and AI's potential place as a medium within the canon of Western art history. So I'm going to begin with a little background about how these first 3 lesson plans came to be. So these 3 lesson plans are part of a larger project that I was involved in. In the spring of 2023, Miami's Howe Center for Writing Excellence put out a call for proposals for faculty learning communities to examine the implications of AI on student learning and how instructors could better use the technology to assist their teaching. Myself and 3 other subject librarians representing a wide range of disciplines answered the call and we were accepted. And we ended up designing a set of 6 lesson plans divided evenly between information literacy and visual literacy that can be used in college-level classrooms to critically examine AI within the context of building these skills. To accomplish this, we tied our lesson plans to the Association of College and Research Libraries, ACRL's Framework for Information Literacy in Higher Education, and the ACRL Framework for Visual Literacy in Higher Education. So as the art librarian, this hopefully comes as no surprise, but I created the lesson plans for visual literacy, which I will share with you all now. The remainder of my presentation, then after that, the theoretical discussions are actually like the abstract ponderings I had while creating the practical lesson plans. Okay, awesome. There we go. So I'm going to begin with a brief introduction to the ACRL Framework for Visual Literacy in Higher Education, since that is what these lesson plans are based on. So the Framework for Visual Literacy was published in 2022, and it is a companion document to the ACRL Framework for Information Literacy, and supersedes the previous Visual Literacy Competency Standards for Higher Education, which was published in 2011. So for the full visual literacy framework, you can see the QR code on the slide there. The framework is divided into 4 emerging themes. These are: learners participate in a changing visual information landscape, learners perceive visuals as communicating information, learners practice visual discernment and criticality, and learners pursue social justice through visual practice. This last frame here, the 4th theme, was added in response to criticism that the Framework for Information Literacy lacks a specific social justice frame. Okay, so, okay, no, I think I'm in the right one. Okay, so the 4 themes of the framework for visual literacy are subdivided into knowledge practices and dispositions. These are then crosswalked to both social justice and the frames of the ACRL framework for information literacy. Knowledge practices and dispositions can be crosswalked to more than one frame. So now we're going to go ahead and get into the kind of 3 practical lesson plans. The ones that I will share with you today are all based around AI image generators like DALL-E and Midjourney. While I will be covering the plans in brief here for the sake of time, I will provide a QR code at the end so that you can see the full lesson plans if you would like. All of these lesson plans, as I said, are based off the ACRL framework for visual literacy. So each lesson addresses one or more of the 4 themes that I just discussed. And all the learning objectives are taken directly from the framework's knowledge practices and dispositions. All of the activities are designed for in-person classes with faculty or instructor-led reflection and discussion. However, they were specifically intended to be flexible and adaptable at the discretion of the instructor. So the first lesson deals with ethics and copyright issues surrounding AI-generated materials. This lesson uses 2 of the frames found in the framework for visual literacy. Learners participate in a changing visual information landscape, and learners perceive visuals as communicating information. On this slide, you can see the learning objectives. So students will research and discuss various AI image generators' copyright policies in order to prioritize ethical considerations for cultural and intellectual property when creating, sharing, or using visuals. Consider if creation and or use of a visual will constitute misappropriation, which disassociates visuals from their original context and deprives individual generators and cultural communities of agency and credit. And realize that visuals in all formats are works of intellectual property. Here is a brief overview of the lesson plan. So this lesson takes on those ethical considerations related to issues of copyright and intellectual property by asking student groups to research an image generator's copyright policies and publicly available critiques of those policies, including recent court cases and rulings. After student groups research these aspects, they present their findings to the class in groups, and the instructor facilitates a class-wide discussion at the end. This lesson is intended to engage students with the current complexities of AI copyright, including who owns the images generated by AI, and inclusion of artists' work in the data set without their consent. Here are some potential questions for discussion. So how do the various AI image generators compare and contrast in how they handle copyright? Which AI image generator has the best copyright for users? Likewise, which one has the worst copyright for users? What does it mean if you didn't find any information on copyright in your AI image generator? And why might this be problematic? And would you hesitate to use any of these tools based on how they handle copyright? If it doesn't come up during student presentations, make sure students are aware of the following, that at least in the US, only a human can own copyright. So Chris Kashtova used Midjourney to illustrate her graphic novel, Zarya of the Dawn, and the US Copyright Office ruled that while she owns the copyright to the written text and the sequence of images, she does not own the copyright to the individual images that she used in that novel. As we all know, AI image generators also use artists' work in the data set without their consent. Getty Images is suing Stability AI, and a group of artists is suing Midjourney for the same thing. So the second lesson plan asks students to investigate bias in the data sets of AI image generators and how their use can reinforce bias. This lesson addresses one theme: learners pursue social justice through visual practice. Here are the learning objectives. So students will research and discuss the data sets of various AI image generators, paying particular attention to information about policies to mitigate bias and bias in the data set in order to acknowledge that no platform is neutral and that concealed factors like suggestion algorithms and power structures within the publishing industry shape experiences with visuals, anticipate the ways in which algorithms, social media, and participatory technologies obscure or promote visuals and visual media generators, which may reflect commercial interests and reinforce existing social dynamics. As for the lesson plan, it's similar to the last one. So again, students are put into groups and tasked with researching how bias is present in the data set and the strategies used by the image generator to mitigate that bias. Student groups then present their findings to the class and again, engage in a class-wide discussion. By participating in this lesson, students learn how bias systemically exists in a system assumed to be neutral. So here you can see some potential questions for discussion. So does the AI image generator acknowledge bias in its data set? If so, what biases are present? If not, can you find other sources that discuss bias in the AI image generator's data set? What are those biases? What are the consequences of bias in the data set? For example, DALL-E took out all sexualized images, so now they have less images of women. So, there are consequences to this. Does the AI image generator attempt to thwart bias in the data set? If so, how? Are there any other rules and or regulations and or restrictions in your AI image generator's data set? What else did you learn about your AI image generator's data set? And why is it important to consider the data set used by an AI image generator? The final lesson is it asks students to consider formal elements and principles of design. This lesson has two themes. Learners perceive visuals as communicating information, and learners practice visual discernment and criticality. Here are your learning outcomes. Students will compare and contrast two images, one created entirely by an artist and the other created in part via DALL-E's outpainting feature in order to explore choices made in the visual production of, explore choices made in the production of visual communications to construct meaning or influence interpretation, especially with regard to representations of gender, ethnicity, race, and other cultural or social identifiers. Examine visuals slowly and deeply in order to develop and refine critical observation skills, and examine visuals for signs of alteration, such as cropping or use of digital filters, and consider the intent and consequences of any changes made. So this lesson depends on a DALL-E tool called outpainting, and outpainting will essentially finish a picture for you using AI. So for example, if you uploaded a picture of Vermeer's girl with a pearl earring to outpainting, you could come up with the result that you see here. So this lesson asks students to compare and contrast those two artworks. So before the lesson, the instructor chooses an artwork, crops it, and then uses outpainting to complete the image via AI. Then, during class, the instructor asks students to determine which artwork was created entirely by the artist and which one was partially generated via DALL-E based on the use of formal elements and principles of design. Students, again, are put into two groups, but this time it is based on their choices, right? Like which one they think was generated by DALL-E, which one was the artist, and asked to formulate their arguments and participate, again, in a class-wide debate. And the point of this lesson isn't necessarily to correctly identify the AI, rather it's to make students think about how artists and AI employ the formal elements and principles of design. It also has the potential to demonstrate to students the challenges inherent in determining whether an image was generated by AI or created by a human being. Here are some potential questions for discussion. So before the correct answer is revealed, has anyone changed their mind based on the discussion? Additional questions include, did you see any mistakes or glitches in the AI image that tipped you off, or ones that you see in retrospect? Which artwork do you think is more successful? Why? How did the artist and AI use formal elements and principles of design differently? And which artwork do you prefer and why? While this idea was not included in the kind of formal lesson plans I created for the faculty learning community, another potential idea, of course, is to have students compare one image created by an artist and another created by AI in the style of that artist. So as promised, here is the QR code to those full lesson plans. This also includes the 3 information literacy ones that my colleagues did as well. So the remainder of my presentation today will be spent on those theoretical discussions surrounding the nature of AI and its relationship to Western art history. So again, a little bit of background here. Before becoming an art librarian, I was an adjunct professor of art history, and I often had versions of these theoretical discussions without the consideration of AI, as either like in-class debates, homework assignments, or more formal graded projects. That said, the ideas that I am going to share with you are so informal they can't really be called lesson plans. However, I will suggest some readings that could support these discussions, in addition to framing how AI image generators raise questions that are already central to the story of Western art. And finally, one more thing. These discussions are just that, they're discussions. There's no real right or wrong answer for students. Instead, it's just, to get students to think critically about it. So, the first one is AI and photography. So this theoretical discussion relates to photography's acceptance as an art medium and how that debate could extend to AI. As it did with photography, art as a discipline needs to contend with AI's potential as an art medium. So as I'm sure you are aware, photography wasn't instantly accepted as an artistic medium upon its invention. Critics, artists, and scientists debated whether photography was a technological tool that recorded visual facts or an artistic medium. And when I cover this topic in art history classes, I typically use Muybridge's studies, particularly this famous image here that proved that the horse, when they gallop, all 4 legs do indeed lift up off the ground, as my example of photography as technology. Alfred Stieglitz, in his progression from pictorialism to street photography, was my example of photography as art. Students would then debate whether photography was a technological tool or not, and they usually concluded that it could be both, right? It depended on how it was being used. So here I have some potential readings that could inform students' arguments on both primary and secondary sources there. Also, there is a potential list of questions. So should or will AI art ever be considered real art? Should we consider AI an artistic tool as well as a technological tool? Where would the line be between the two? Do you think AI will cause digital photography to decline as a medium in favor of a return to film photography and darkroom processes? And can the artist ever be replaced by a machine or technology? And the final theoretical discussion that I have for you here is AI and conceptual art, or I think of it as, or what would Duchamp think? So this one here, of course, Duchamp believed that the idea behind the artwork was the most important thing. So how does that relate to AI, where a machine is generating an image based on words or the idea of the person requesting the image? So another typical discussion that I had when either introducing data or conceptual art was the Richard Mutt case, where Duchamp submitted a urinal, turned on its side to a non-juried exhibition, and was rejected. Duchamp, of course, published a defense of the artwork, which he called Fountain, where he argued that the idea behind the art, not the aesthetics or craftsmanship, was what made art art. Students would then discuss whether Duchamp was right. Is Fountain art? I will say that this was always like the biggest debate that I had in class. Like even if my students were like completely disengaged the entire semester, this one got them hype. They had thoughts about this. And some students agreed with Duchamp, but others really resisted that idea, particularly like in art appreciation classes where they weren't necessarily art majors. So here on this slide, you have your potential readings, including, of course, Duchamp's defense of Fountain. And then you also have some potential questions here. Is the idea behind the art the most important thing? Why or why not? How does this relate to AI? Does AI count as conceptual art? How do you think AI will make the hand of the artist do you think AI will make the hand of the artist more important? Do you think AI will make craftsmanship more important? And then finally, what would Duchamp think of AI? Another idea could be to consider AI in relation to Andy Warhol, who famously said he wanted to be a machine. And that's what I have for you today.
Our next speaker today is Kirsty Edginton, who is the Systems Librarian at the Architectural Association.
Hi, yes, I am Kirsty Edginton and I am the Systems Librarian at the Architectural Association. And today I'd like to talk to you about creativity and AI text-to-image tools. I think it's a really important topic because we're finding that more and more students are using things like Midjourney and DALL-E in their work. There's lots of perception about how they might be cheating or potentially kind of like not doing the work. And I wanted to know whether actually AI could be considered as part of the creative process and actually it had like kind of validity to it because students don't feel creative using it. So the first thing I wanted to explore was kind of what is creativity? And this is a big topic. It's not just something that you can condense down into one sentence. It really varies across disciplines. So say if you're in computer science, you might think of creativity as something different to the arts potentially. But something that kind of came up a lot is that creativity generally produces novel or unique outputs. That is something that's surprising. I really like Mariam Zone's definition of creativity as something that's novel and also intentional. So she did this study where she created images using AI, abstract images, and then compared them to ones submitted to Art Basel in 2016, and got participants to try and guess which ones were the AI. And overwhelmingly, they couldn't differentiate them. Which I think really speaks to the fact that AI can create something that looks surprising or novel or unique in its outputs. So the question then was, do students, because the AI is not necessarily intentional with this, do the students adding the intentionality then create creative outputs in the system? To explore this, I was kind of thinking along 3 different lines. So the first one was intentionality and control. So does AI produce something that you feel like you have control over it? Does it create the image you have in your head? And if it doesn't, do people still feel creative if they can give up some of that control? The second was thinking about bias. We all know that AI has a tendency towards bias. And does this affect how creative students use when they're using it? And the last point was copyright. I was really interested in how, because the AI is trained on all these other artists' data, do students then feel like their work is unique at the end of it? Are they conscious of the fact that they're kind of remoulding other people's artworks? I interviewed a few students for this and also looked at some first-hand accounts from architects who were experimenting with AI, just to kind of get a sense of how they felt they were using it. I mainly focused on Midjourney because this kind of seemed to be the most popular tool, both from the experiments that architects were doing, but also the students who were involving it in their practice. When I tested out some of the free tools, they weren't nearly as powerful, and they didn't necessarily give you the granularity that you get with Midjourney, so that's why I decided to focus on it. AI and the creative process. So I first kind of wanted to establish where the AI was being used, and there were kind of three main areas. One was for inspiration, people kind of using it at the start of their projects, thinking about new ideas. The main one was sort of modelling, and you can see this here. So one of the students I talked to, she integrated these pieces of furniture that used kind of Taoist design principles into her work. She said that normally creating something in the Taoist design could take maybe 5 to 20 years to actually do, but this was just kind of a feature of her project, and she wanted to give an idea of what a Taoist design would look like rather than the full kind of, rather than it being the main focus of her design. So you can see where she's integrated it into a Taoist garden of the Chronogate, which is what she called it. And it's quite interesting that she could speed up the process by using kind of like an amalgamation or suggestion of the design she wanted with the AI tools. This kind of reflects what architects in practice feel like they're using it for. So they said quite often they would think to use it in client presentations. So when they're kind of sketching out ideas to pitch to clients, they didn't really feel that the tools had the capability to produce something as an end result, mainly because it's not fit for kind of dimensional scaling, so it doesn't do proportions very well. So if you want to kind of build on something that the AI has produced, it's not going to give you the lines you need to actually make the building. So overall, it kind of felt like students were using it in the process, but never really as the final design. So first I wanted to explore kind of the control and the intention. So students didn't feel like the AI was leading them in any way. That's something I wanted to ask at the beginning. Because obviously when you're creating these designs, it can give you different outputs and it might kind of shape your vision. But most students I talked to actually felt that they had an image in their minds they wanted to complete, and that they were just trying to get the AI to where they needed it to go. So you can see here, I asked a student to come up with a project, and she used a visual essay that she'd written earlier in the year to try and get some visuals for that essay. And so from the top here, you can see the prompts that she's used, and then these are the images that Midjourney created. In the first two images, the AI tool completely misses the mining operations section of the prompt, and she didn't really feel that the landscape of the steppe or like Mongolia was being represented. So she adapted the prompt in the end to say grasslands because that's more kind of what she had in her mind, and really like emphasised the mining by taking out other elements of the prompt and putting this purple haze on to get the space style that she wanted. But then she realised because she'd changed it so much, she didn't maybe get like the little bits of destruction or kind of wasteland that she thought she needed. Overall, she said that it was more a lack of understanding of how to prompt the AI, the language that she needed to use, that made her feel that she didn't have control over the image. And she hoped that with more kind of learning and experience, she'd be able to get to pinpoint that exact place that she wanted. This student here, our Taoist design furniture maker, had actually used AI for 2 years. So the initial project she did was game design, and she was kind of creating like modelling images for ideas for game design. And she said when she first used it, she was kind of using it quite loosely. She was just giving it textual prompts, but not really going in and refining them much. She was just using it for like a general idea. And then as she learned more about the AI, she started feeding the AI images and refining them and using kind of Midjourney's additional features, like you can specify ratios and add kind of textual or like themes to the top of the image to make it more adapted to what you want. Interestingly, even though she learned so much over 2 years with how to use the AI, she still didn't necessarily feel like it gave her full control over what the image was. She wanted to try out other tools such as maybe Stable Diffusion, which she kind of heard you could put more of your own work into, but she hadn't used it just yet. So Midjourney as a tool didn't seem to quite satisfy that level of like idealization, being able to put what you had in your mind onto the AI image. This is something that a lot of academics have talked about, is the way that kind of how teaching and learning, how AI tools, because they're so easy to use, people that wouldn't necessarily normally feel creative using them, in like the art sector, would be able to feel creative with AI because they can pick it up quite quickly. But actually, from what I read and heard, it does require a large amount of teaching and learning and literacy to actually get to the result you need to do it. So it's not the case of, you can obviously experiment at the very beginning, but it's still something you have to learn and adapt with to get where you need to go. Another thing that academics suggested is that the creative process is not necessarily in the final output. So if you don't think you can get to kind of the exact idea that you have in your head, perhaps where you can be creative is in the curatorial process, that is the selecting of the images. So Midjourney is a really interesting tool for this because actually every time you give it a prompt, it gives you 4 different images and you have to choose one each time to refine. Students generally said they picked an image because it looked like what they had in their head, you know, the closest to what they were thinking about, or because they liked the aesthetic. But generally, they didn't actually feel like the selection process was necessarily creative. They felt more creative when they were designing the prompts themselves, which is also a form of curation, but I just thought it was interesting to highlight. Another thing that was interesting about the curatorial process, is that one of the students felt it was actually quite different to how she would usually practice design. So when she was designing, you know, to create something physically or even digitally with the tool that she was making the art herself, she would collect all of her reference images, she'd collect the styles she wanted to use, she'd do her research, and then when she came to actually making the image, she'd do it in quite an innovative and free-flowing way, and that's where the creativity kind of came. Whereas with the AI, she felt that it was actually, she was doing kind of like the free-flowing at the beginning of the AI, kind of experimenting with the prompts, and then when she had the idea, she was going in to refine it. This is something that lots of people have talked about, and obviously Stefanie talked about in her previous lecture as well, about how like AI actually might be something new and create new ways of creative practice. The same way that photography potentially inspired different forms of art and abstract. AI might make us think more about kind of the thought process or the language that we use and then inspire kind of creative practices in that way. The next thing I wanted to explore was bias. So one of my students who wasn't quite satisfied with the level of control she had on the output, one of the reasons she said that she wasn't satisfied was because Midjourney in particular didn't give her gave her something that was always stylized, always had kind of an AI tone to it. And this is something that I kind of found when I was looking at, you know, just experimenting with Midjourney. You can't quite see, but it's meant to say New York in the rain and Upper Manhattan in the sunshine. And these are the only 2 things I put in as the prompts. And you can see in the first set of images, they look almost like they've been taken as a picture. So you can see the rain on the lens, it's a little bit sharper in the focus. Whereas in the Upper Manhattan picture, they're kind of more painting-like, a little bit watercolour or even oil paintings. And there's nothing in my prompts that made them go in either direction. So something really important to highlight when we're talking to students about using these tools is that you need to formulate what kind of style you want your image to be in, and then be really clear with the AI when you're making these prompts that that's how you want the prompt to look. One of the students also was talking about how actually she did have an idea of style, but because the AI wasn't trained on that artist, she couldn't fully realise that style, or she had to investigate more about kind of what made up the features of that style so that she could put that prompt into the AI. The other thing with bias, as we all know, is that it can be biased against kind of marginalised communities or make assumptions about people. When I asked students about whether they were thinking through these kind of biases when they're using the AI, most of them actually said they weren't necessarily concerned about that bias. I think potentially because a lot of our architect students do make more scenery images or buildings or features, but actually the feedback I got is that they didn't find it so different to the bias that we naturally have within ourselves. And they always really feel like when they're creating, they're critically thinking about those things. Good teaching at the AA. And then, so actually the bias, like challenging that bias in these AI systems wasn't so different. One student commented that she felt like almost she could actually step outside of her personal bias using AI, because she often referenced images from Pinterest or Instagram, or her Google searches were attuned to the things that she liked. And actually by using this AI system, she could break away from that personal bubble that she had and interrogate things in a new way. I think another element of bias that's really important to consider is that Matt Barron highlights is that, and actually Stefanie's talked about in her previous lectures, a thought experiment, is this whole idea that these AI text-to-image tools have not safe for work filters on them. So things like Midjourney, they ban words like blood and gore. They're not allowed to, you're not allowed to use sexual imagery. And Matt Byron kind of explores this in his image that he made of Midjourney, the meat machine, where he tries to kind of work around how those AI filters and create something that is taboo or grotesque, which I quite liked. And I think it highlights the fact that these machines are not just biased in the the visual outputs that they're generating because they're trained on data sets, but they're also biased in the way that they're controlled and who owns them and kind of who is driving that narrative. And if students can't then use these terms, how can they subvert social norms? So I think that's really interesting to highlight and point out when you're teaching about AI. And then the last thing I wanted to look at was perceptions of originality or copyright. Talking to students, they didn't really feel like their works weren't their own because they were trained on other artists. This kind of really contrasts with architectural accounts from architects, because they actually have a body of work out in the public where students may not have things that the AI would copy. But it also might speak to kind of a changing understanding of originality in the age of AI, in the same way that you might have been brought up with phones, it changes your habits. It might change kind of the moral understanding of what is, taking from other artists. And these students might just grow up in an age where it's normal to have data sets trained on it. But then also, because prompting and the design process is so laborious with AI, and you do have to learn and you have to teach yourself, some people also think that actually that process of labour means that, the end result is yours. So Stefanie Buchbauker says that by fulfilling a final gesture of final polishing, she saves herself from a dilemma regarding the intellectual properties of the images produced. She has the happy paternity of it, period. So I think we might see a lot more of that kind of discourse about ownership and kind of labour becoming ownership and the change of the images. Yes, so that's kind of the main presentation. So just to kind of summarise, it does feel like AI can be included in the creative process. It really varies between people as to whether they feel like it's just a tool or something that they actually, feel creative with. But that might change as people become more and more used to using AI overall. Thank you.
Okay, I'm delighted to present Andrew Gray, who is my colleague at LCC. He's a copyright librarian for UAL, and with him is Roxanne Peters, who is an intellectual property education specialist and the IP team at UAL. I said, oh, you're the manager, and she said, no, there's just me. And they're going to be talking about copyright and ethics around copyright, which is really great because those topics have come up a lot this morning, so looking forward to hearing it.
Thanks, can you all hear me? I'm not used to being mic'd up. Perfect. Well, first of all, it's really great to be in this space with you. I've not spoken at Arts before, and Andrew, connected with me because we're both working in such liminal spaces, very local to here at University of Arts, so we're here. And we're down to speak for an hour, but we're going to try and do half an hour, maybe some questions, and hopefully more time for you to have lunch as well. But following the amazing presentations this morning, I think it was really interesting hearing both Stefanie and Kirsty really kind of looking at kind of the detail with when they're working on the ground with students as educators and some of the kind of things that are coming up. I guess for the first section of this talk, I wanted to kind of give a more kind of contextual, bigger picture of how we're working at UAL with our students, what our role is, and then Andrew's going to speak a bit more about some of the challenges we're facing in our role as educators, but also some of the opportunities and looking at the current AI landscape and kind of the intersections with law and ethics as well. So I'm very bad at following my slides.
Try again. Just go back. No, just go back.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, so over the next few minutes, we're going to really share who we support and how, the key opportunities and challenges within creative education, and then really thinking about what we can do to support the next generation of creatives. And I know we're in a really big space, but it's always really nice to have kind of shared experiences and really like-minded people in the space, and really thinking about, in quite a community space, how we can work together more closely and collaboratively. So as Eleanor already said, I am the IP education specialist at UAL. I think it's important to say that I'm based within careers and employability, so I'm not in the legal team, and it's really for me about positioning intellectual property and copyright in a very human-centred, relational and dynamic way, so that our students can really understand the potential agency and value they have in what they do, what they've got to say, making sure they're heard, they're respected. So I think, not to speak on behalf of Andrew as well, but I take a very kind of social justice kind of driven approach to intellectual property outside of just the economics of making a living. It's also really understanding students' motivations and ambitions and really thinking about their behaviour. I think when it comes to sort of using and interacting with AI, I think really helping them understand how they can be responsible and accountable, and really it's that thinking around something, really getting people to think critically about what they're doing to help with that education. I'll just let Andrew talk a little bit more about his role.
I'm the copyright librarian here at University of Arts. I've been here for 18 months, I think, I was here years ago. I kind of fell into this role, so to speak. I've done various roles in various libraries. My areas of interest is creative practice. I'm quite interested in sort of power relations, and that's why I've always got into copyright, open access, the commons, so those sorts of things interest me. And now AI has, in a weird way, has kind of raised the profile of copyright, which I'll discuss a bit later.
So I just wanted to start with these 3 quotes, because I think it really, again, helps position this kind of human-centred, kind of responsible approach to the intersection that we're working at with creativity, education, and I think whilst I'm the IP education specialist and I deal with things around trademarks, patents, design rights as well, I think with AI, as we've already heard this morning, I think the reality of copyright has been overlooked quite a lot, and this, I think it's really starting to come to the fore with people's sort of understanding and decision making around the choices they're kind of dealing with. So the first one is kind of more of a legal, social justice perspective, really acknowledging that copyright doesn't exist in a vacuum. Its purposes are best realised when it is interpreted to enable all citizens to participate in the development of society and culture. So I think again I feel like, and I don't know if any of you within your work find this as well, but it's so much part of our everyday lives. So I think one of the challenges Andrew and I always talk about is just, even getting it in for people to understand what copyright is, let alone how it really impacts societal and kind of culture. And then I think from an educational perspective, it's really kind of the way that we are approaching our relationships with students is very much one of compassionate pedagogy, and really not just transmitting information to students, but really being responsive to how this generation are working, how they think, what their concerns are, and then framing our knowledge around that, and that's sort of how those dynamics work. And then I think from a creator's perspective, some of you might know the work of musicians Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, who have got a really amazing exhibition coming up at the Serpentine Galleries in October. But really acknowledging from a creative perspective that AI demands new ideological frameworks of consent and attribution. The polar ideologies of free culture of rigid IP protectionism of the last century feel insufficient. So again, I think it's just that reality that all of us, whatever we do in our professional lives or our personal lives, the law is always chasing technology. It's never going to keep up. I was at a law and AI conference last week, and a leading judge in the UK who kind of is always kind of working within courts on case law, acknowledged that at the moment IP is very far down the list of priorities in terms of what needs to be updated. So the reality is we're working within these really outdated frameworks. It's not new. I think Stefanie was talking about like photography as an artistic medium, and these kind of technological changes always then prompt kind of conversations or fear or kind of looking at opportunities about how we move forward. So yeah, just really briefly, I think the reality is what I forgot to say before, and one of my very good ex-colleagues is in the room actually. I moved from the cultural heritage sector into creative education because I was very conscious and couldn't quite believe that everything that makes me personally work in terms of like music, fashion, photography, art, design, it's the area of law that isn't really explained or made available to most creatives. And I think working in careers and employability now, it's really important that people are informed so they can make conscious decisions. So I think historically, IP and copyright education tends to be taught to people training to become law professionals, some areas of enterprise, but there's still this real kind of disconnect between creativity and being informed and educated around law and ethics. And I think a lot of you in the room may have had to, like as both Andrew and I have had to, how we both are in this position now is because we had to really learn on the ground the day-to-day reality of managing collections, archives, library content, and people interacting and wanting to learn, and us not really knowing what we can make available. So I think it's just really that acknowledgement really that we're still working in these very kind of liminal spaces, and it's kind of, I think it's important with the conversations around AI that we start thinking about how to work more collectively. So the way that we're approaching, with the small resource that we have is really thinking, as I said before, it's really thinking about people and practice. So it could be 1 minute I'm speaking to MA Biodesign here at Central St Martin's, the next minute could be Fine Art at Chelsea, the next minute it could be costume design at Wimbledon, the next it could be fashion futures at London College of Fashion. So we have all these students working in very interdisciplinary, innovative ways, and I feel like we have this responsibility and duty of care to really, as much as we can, support them and prepare them for the real world scenarios they're going to be in. So what we tend to do is obviously reference key legal principles, but it's really, again, almost like demystifying the legal language and actually framing it within the context that we're working in. But I think also the emphasis is really, as I said before, it's helping people build their confidence. And, you know, there's so many creatives here who, their minds are so brilliant, they just don't know how to move forward, whether it's as entrepreneurs or if they're freelancing or if they're collaborating with, you might have an artist and technologist, and that's where the AI things are starting to kind of really creep in as well. So as I've said here, it's just a snapshot just to really acknowledge, yes, we're based in the UK, international students who sometimes are then going back to work in other countries, and the acknowledgement that obviously the law is international with its various nuances as well, so acknowledging that. And as I've said here, it's just lots of ways in which AI may be used. And these are some of the questions to date that we get asked the most. That's not obviously definitive, but as you can see, it's quite wide-ranging. So it could be right from the point of creating something and having an idea, right through to really a lot of concerns about and worry about sharing work online, their portfolios, showcasing. Again, I'm mentioning all these things because I think what we're all navigating and what we are finding increasingly is obviously all these things have an AI component to them, and I think it goes much further than the academic misconduct if somebody's maybe used ChatGPT within an essay, and obviously that's a really important thing to address, but I think it's just being mindful that there's lots of pockets of really good activity going on that, because we're such a big university, we don't necessarily always know, but where possible we're trying to make kind of our educational remit much more streamlined and focused on what people really need and what they're actually asking us. So these are just some of the areas. And I think what I find as well is if people are concerned that they're going to do something wrong or they think somebody's copied them, it tends to not always be about they haven't been paid for something, but it's really that form of attribution and acknowledgement that I think is when I say, what is it that's upset you or how are you feeling about this? And that's not to say, obviously, I'm very much here to support and help people think how they think strategically about how they make a living from what they do. But I think that has been really interesting recently in some of the conversations and presentations this morning around the value and importance of attribution when it comes to AI and who owns what. And I haven't got this in real time, but I just wanted to share this with you in terms of to date what we've been doing to try and, again, with our small resource, but also how we can try and help students think critically and make choices that are right for them. So this is actually an online resource that was created during 2020 in lockdown. It was co-designed with creatives for creatives, and it's non-linear in its approach to really reflect the way creatives are working. So there's 5 sections of the e-learning resource. It's creating, protecting, managing, using and sharing, and it is combined of legal principles, student case studies. It's only so much people want to listen to me going on. It's actually really important they see themselves and have peer experiences and stories to share. And it's become what started out as a self-led tool for students has also inadvertently, in a really positive way, become a really good way to embed it within curriculum design, because everything we do is outside of curriculum. So it's always kind of, we're not measured by anything in terms of how you know that we're making an impact and how we can really support students in the way they need. It's been very much this peripheral kind of thing people get scared about and think about afterwards when I'm trying to centre it and foreground it in every conversation. And now that people are starting to think about AI here in a much more formalised way, we're always trying to kind of jump into working groups or like look at guidelines where we can add value from our sort of kind of perspectives working on the ground with our students. Some of you might be familiar with the recent GIST report on student perceptions of generative AI, and I think there's a really interesting bit around creativity and idea development, which, given a lot of our students, as I said, it's working at the intersection of art, design and technology, a lot around innovation and enterprise, but also people just setting up on their own. And I think it's just a short quote to just really reinforce. I think a lot of people, there's a lot of fear around AI, but I think, and challenges obviously, but I think it's also looking at what the possibilities are for inspiration, for embracing it and accepting it's not over there somewhere. We're all kind of engaging with it right now and thinking about, potentially how we can work together in the future to support in the best way that we can. I think. Yeah, so this is just what I've already really covered, but I think it is this intersection of legal, ethical, educational mainly within a creative space, but also being mindful that a lot of our creatives are, a lot of them are working on projects and initiatives that are around social good. So they might be working with environmentalists, they might be working with like biotech companies. So when it comes to all the copyright and IP conversations, and AI again is part of this, it starts to come back to, who owns what, what's protected, how's it being used, are there any things to consider around consent and how people are being represented, why you want to work with a certain company, does it align with your ethos and vision? So a lot of it is a lot of questions rather than answers, and I feel like we're not really here to give answers as such. Often there aren't any, or there's not one specific answer, but it's really to help people start to think about their own approach to risk, for example, thinking about their own lived experiences and really what's right for them right now. I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, who's going to talk a bit more about the current AI landscape and a little bit more around some of the challenges and opportunities. If I've forgotten anything.
No, I don't think so.
Yes. Over.
Thank you very much. That's it, me. So, one of the things in copyright, I suppose in IP, we always get these questions and people wanting yes or no. And often we're going back and go, maybe, it depends. And so this kind of unease, uncertainty just seems to be common in this particular area. One, and it's touched on earlier in the earlier presentation, around authorship and originality. So these two areas have suddenly become, again, quite prominent in when we think about AI and copyright. I'm going to read out this first quote. It's from the people who work as there, Copyright Designs and Patents Act 1988. Amount of times I say that or write that in an email. So authorship, and this particular, I think this is an amendment from about 96, I think it is. That's quite interesting. And it says, in the case of a literary, dramatic, musical, artistic work which is computer generated, the author shall be taken to be the person by whom the arrangements necessary for the creation of the work are undertaken. So this was written before we had an AI. So there, within UK law, there is an idea that a computer generated work could have copyright. The other element of this is obviously who actually gets that authorship. Would it be the coders, the people who've created the tool itself? Could it be the owners of the tool if they've done that as part of their work? Or could it be the people actually using the tool, entering the prompts? So this area is very unsure. No one really knows here in the UK. It actually hasn't been addressed, so we're all still unsure. And then recently, in 2023, this High Court case came up, and this was around originality and around what is the definition of originality. So to have a work that has copyright, you have to be original. It could be badly original or originally bad, like a lot of what I do. But this is key. So the author was able to express their creative abilities in the production of the work by making free and creative choices, so as to stamp the work created with their personal touch. This criterion is not satisfied where the content of the work is dictated by technical considerations, rules or other constraints which leave no room for creative freedom. So we could say that is around the algorithms or actually using AI where they have these tools. There's an idea of having a personal touch. And I think it's where is the line? Is it putting in 500 prompts? When does it actually become yours? Or you've actually created something. I've heard where people will take it and they're using AI tools and then maybe putting it in Adobe Photoshop or doing something else. We're still not sure. So we have, or myself and Roxanne, we work with these sort of uncertain areas. Obviously, with our students, we want them to carry on creating their work, do their work, not worry so much. And we've got to try and interpret these things for them. We're kind of paid to do that rather than them having to read such legal areas. Going on to a bit more other current legal questions. Again, another quote here from the EFF, which I found quite interesting. Copyright law doesn't prevent you from making factual observations about work or copying the facts embodied in the work. Rather, copyright forbids you from copying the work's creative expression. So this is being advanced by some of the AI tech companies, and we've seen certain legal observers saying that where a work is boiled down to its elements, to the actual data. I'm not technically minded enough to know exactly how an AI tool works, but this is something that I'm starting to think about. So I always think about like a film noir. There are certain facts around a film noir. So what would you be doing? So this again causes unease. Seemingly every week there's a new court case, so constant court cases where people are being sued. One of the big areas is around training data. So we know some of the data sets which are open, we know that are there, but lots of the data sets, the AI companies are quite reticent about saying that they have used them. So some of it is definitely copyrighted work. The accusations from publishers, big ones, Getty, is saying that there's mass copyright infringement. Their defence is it's actually fair. They've got fair use, fair dealing here in the UK. They're using only certain elements of that. So that again causes unease. Then the actual final output, so what's actually produced when you've done your prompts, something's come out, does it substantially copy somebody else's work? Can that be proved? I think last week I saw a court case which is, get them right, the Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA, are suing two new music software companies, Suno and Udio, saying the works that they've produced, they've got evidence, saying that some of them substantially similar to, say, a Chuck Berry song, where they're using actual parts of the same lyrics, parts of the same melody and tune. Interesting to see what actually happens there. Is that actually just style? But you can see this actually happening continually. I mean, and is there a new copyright? If you created the work, is there a new copyright? Here on the left here, Zariah of the Dawn, a comic book, which was given copyright. You applied for copyright, they gave copyright. Then it came out that actually it was all generated by an AI. So within the US, it's decided that copyright cannot exist if something is generated by an AI. So that's no longer copyright apart from, funny enough, the stories, the text. That is still copyrighted by an actual person. So we have that, and then what I found quite amusing recently, again with these music generators, there is, if I can remind myself what the name is, there was a piece of music called BBL Drizzy, I don't know if anyone's aware of that, was produced. It has lyrics, but it has music which is generated. So the music has no copyright in the US. It was then sampled by somebody else around this dispute between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. So you have this very interesting area where work that has no copyright in it is being sampled. So people are kind of starting to use that. But we're having it's a global technology, there's global differences. In China, a court case gave copyright to an AI-generated image. Somebody created an image, then someone else took that image and reused it. The person who originally created it was upset. It's interesting about attribution, they actually removed their watermark, maybe that would have solved it. They took them to court, claiming that their rights had been contravened. The court then decided that the image itself had copyright in it, and then they could sue them. So we have multiple areas where everyone's a little bit unsure. There's all these different types of rules, lots of different decisions, and we're trying to advise our students, we're trying to advise ourselves in this area. So we're kind of feeling a little bit unsure ourselves. But luckily it's not just me and Roxanne here tackling this. So we're starting to see lots of organisations coming into play here. The Design and Artist Copyright Society here in the UK, DAX, so kind of licensing agency, a great report, a survey, speaking to over 1,000 artists, and there's real obvious concern around what AI could be potentially doing and about their own livelihood. We've then got government departments. You can remember what DC Met, Department for Culture, Media and Sport, also now starting to look at AI and heritage. There's research, the Responsible AI for Heritage and Human Rights. So they're looking at AI and the bias that is in AI and how that could potentially impact what people do with heritage works. And as Roxanne mentioned earlier, there's Matt Dryhurst and Holly Hernandez. So we have actual artists now trying to step into this arena where they've actually been in this arena for a while. We've got a site called Spawning and Have I Been Trained? So Have I Been Trained? You can look to see if your works are in a data set. I believe now they've got some agreement with Stability AI. Well, Stability AI will recognise and beware if somebody has opted out of their work being trained, they'll say that they will observe that. And you can see within all these areas, we're starting to see artists and licensing agencies and other people starting to step into the arena to say this is what's actually starting to happen. We need to make our voices heard. Back to maybe this DAX report, which again I'd say is incredibly interesting because it's the first time I've actually seen a big survey of actual artists. You know, kind of hear things anecdotally, and this is something that our students are starting to think about, or we want them to start to be aware about. So one of the big things is obviously consent, control, and compensation. These have become kind of a bit of a mantra, and I have seen some of these start to be mirrored in other content industry organisations. I know some book publishers have started to look at some of this. And also it's transparency, which we kind of briefly touched upon. We're not sure exactly what's in there. Obviously today in the UK, it's election day, so there will be a new government probably. What are their priorities? You know, what will actually be happening? The current government, it was sort of like, let's just wait and see. The new government, maybe they want to do more regulation around that. We're not exactly sure. And then international competitive or licensing. It's kind of maybe, I think for creatives, the better the devil you know licensing. That seems to be the approach. I think there are some, anyone who's worked in libraries for a long time knows there's always some issues around with people with licensors. Sometimes they kind of charge us extortionate amounts. And obviously, copyright in itself is a sort of, the idea around it is to give some incentive to creatives to continue creating work, to give some sort of compensation. If suddenly that compensation starts to disappear, I'm sure they'll still create, but will they want to share it as much? I mean, it could have a real actual impact on what actually we start to see being produced. We kind of touched on Roxanne kind of briefly touched on this before. So these are some of the questions. I think probably Roxanne, you're getting more of the juicier ones than maybe me. Some of the questions were, again, I'd be really interested to hear maybe in the questions if you're getting similar sorts of questions. So always we're trying to work with our students, and, to get them to critically think about what they're doing, their relationships with the people that they're working with themselves, with the communities, and start to think, well, how does this actually start to change what I'm doing? I mean, we kind of briefly talked about this, me and Roxanne, earlier, like some of the questions I've had previously, I can imagine maybe in the next 6 months they'll add an AI element, as someone who was making a film based on a recently dead artist where they create puppets of them, making a film. But what if they could suddenly recreate that person as a sort of deep fake? What would the implications be? It'd be interesting to see what's actually happening in that arena. And our key challenges are always, these actually haven't changed. We've always had most of these challenges. They've just continued. AI has just made them, in certain ways, maybe for us or for me, especially a bit prominent. The lack of legal certainty. So laws outdated. People are using the tools. They're creating. How do we advise them? If you've created some work, do you have copyright in it? What should you be doing with it? What should you be thinking about that? Lack of awareness. Anyone who's worked in this area, copyright is not everyone's favourite area. That's where it ends up with people like me. And so, with creatives, do they really want to think about it? But it's probably something they do need to start thinking about, especially as they're using AI. And like this, the dynamic of law, technology and behaviour. Because we're all kind of individuals, we move through different spaces. What you do at home is different from how you use technology and your behaviour than you would at work, and then in the educational realm. So for our students also, it's for getting them to think about the different environments they are in, and so they can respond to that. That can be quite a complex area. And we work in institutions which have priorities, really, and when I've ever spoken to, a few times I've ever spoken to someone very senior, they have like 2 or 3 priorities. Whatever I'm interested in is nowhere near what they are interested in. But copyright is here and AI is here. Those conversations are happening. Roxanne says we've tried to wheedle our way in, if that's the right word. You hear something, you kind of go, hi, let us in, let's have a conversation, let's speak to your students, let's contribute to your policy. And as we both, I'm in the library, which is great, and I have amazing colleagues and I can draw upon their connections, but I'm not part of a curriculum, I'm not there day to day doing the teaching, so Roxanne, so we sometimes hear about things quite late. I'll have everyone get in, it's like, we're putting our film online tomorrow, I've used all this other work, can you have a look at it and tell me if it's okay? It's just, that will be, I'm sure that's a common thing that you will have, Roxanne. Oh, and now next.
I'm going to keep talking about what you're talking about. It's really interesting. I like that you all reacted to that last minute, kind of like, please can you express some of it? I think the thing is as well, a lot of our work, it sits outside the curriculum, but we don't have any governance or infrastructure. I'm only speaking from a sort of UAL perspective because that's what I'm familiar with, but I think when it comes to intellectual property, which as you know, copyright's part of the family of, I think within a university context, when it is considered, it tends to be predominantly knowledge exchange, tech transfer projects and outputs where you can measure kind of funding and kind of outputs in a really tangible way. And I think a lot of what we are navigating with copyright is sometimes that intangibility of part of the creative process through to the practice. And I think trying to put a pin in those things when you're trying to influence decision makers can be one of the biggest challenges. But I think we had the slide on challenges. I think it's also I was just talking to Andrew earlier on, I think, and it's a bit like when I worked in the museum sector, I got really excited when we did an exhibition that featured a really prominent musician, because I was like, now they're going to understand the complexities of rights management, copyright clearance for like music, films and all the rest of it. And in a similar way, I feel with copyright, the conversations that are happening around AI, they sort of go hand in hand. You can't not be talking about it, but we're still finding when it comes to accountability and thinking about who might be liable, or accountability if something were to go wrong, as much as it's about attributing others, that's still something that's really in its infancy. But I just wanted to end on this quote. It sort of, I guess, bookends kind of how we might be thinking about intellectual property, which, as you will, I'm sure, all be aware, is built on dominant knowledge systems. So it's really looking at almost this decolonial approach to IP right now for the future. And this quote's from an IP law professor in the US, who says, "These debates are not about markets and money, they are about what it means to be treated equally and with dignity, not only under copyright law, but more generally, and especially today, when the planet's natural resources are becoming scarce, and when empathy and cooperation are necessary to survive." And I think it's really, again, you can't get away from the fact that, the way IP law works, it essentially underpins trade, it underpins a hell of a lot of stuff. But I think it's also, kind of making it human-centred. And I think when we're thinking about the relationship between human and machine, whilst machines are not sentient beings at the moment, but that's not to say they might not become so, you've got all of this bit in between that we're trying to manage. So I think it's just to really approach some of this with mutual respect and kindness, and really thinking about the value of, whilst we're all working, as Andrew said, we're all individuals, but I think we all bring so much to a collective space. That's why you're all at this conference, I would imagine. So I just wanted to end on that, and then just end on one of probably many questions to think about. But thank you for listening. This is the first time we've done something like this together, because we are just, in our own spaces, but trying to work more collaboratively. So thanks for listening, and if you've got any questions, it'd be great to hear from you.
Early AI papers were coming out about computer vision, about how computers can see the world. So I guess, the first moment I became really aware of AI, who remembers this? AlphaGo. So that was like across the road. This was when the first machine learning algorithm built the Go champion. That was DeepMind, just across the road from here, started by a couple of UCL grads. And I guess so I was at art school when this happened. It was a massive moment in AI. And it really kind of excited me conceptually, because this was like a massive thing. It basically effectively had to make a kind of creative, intuitive move. I think anyone that plays this ancient game of Go would say you kind of play it quite intuitively. So obviously, like AI, machine learning algorithms, well actually back then they used decision tree algorithms, beat Kasparov at chess, way back in like the 90s, so this isn't like a new thing, kind of playing games, but this was a moment where they really thought that a computer wasn't going to be able to beat the champions. There's infinitely more complexity to this game, variations of the board, possible next moves. I think it's like, if chess, like you have 400 possible next moves, in Go you have like 13,000 possible next moves, and I think there are more variations of the Go board than there are atoms in the universe. So like, to play this game, they had to create a new kind of algorithm that would play itself many, many, many times over and over, until it could start to kind of play this game quite intuitively in the way that a human might effectively play it. I think, in a way, like, when I kind of found out about these early algorithms, what they were doing, it wasn't obvious to me yet how, as an artist, I would use any of this stuff, but I think conceptually it just really excited me and fascinated me. So I kind of followed this research quite a lot. So I know this isn't a science talk, don't worry, there aren't going to be too many diagrams, I'm going to get onto the art very soon. But I guess a lot of this stems back to a really simple concept, which is a neural network, and underlying all the technologies that we're using at the moment. So I think, like I said earlier, as part of my kind of job is to try and demystify and talk a bit about this technology. But but from an artist's perspective. So I guess, yeah, going right back to the start of this technology, right now we have like these huge black box models, like ChatGPT, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E, kind of built by big tech companies. So it's harder and harder to kind of really like dig deep into how these technologies are working, because there's so many layers of abstraction to them. But when I was kind of starting to work with these, you really were like coding these neural networks yourself. And I mean, the concept is really simple. Just have a quick look at my notes so I don't get too confused here. I guess it's actually, yeah, so you have input data going in. That might be like pixel data from an image, that might be kind of cancer diagnosis data, financial data, sound, language, whatever that is. And then you have these like hidden neurons. And it uses very simple mathematics to effectively kind of use this algorithm called backpropagation, where it will go back and forth and rearrange the weights inside these hidden layers to kind of make sense of this data, to sort of start plotting it in space and say, okay, all of these are images of cats and all of these are images of dogs. And these sort of hidden layers inside, say these sort of certain pixels would sort of give it these weightings, and then we have an output, and it will give us kind of, it will make sense of the data, whatever data we're giving it. I think, in a way, this concept of AI, like talking about artificial intelligence, I have a big issue with. I think it's such a fluffy term that often doesn't really mean very much. It's often like this thing that we're sort of moving towards and haven't quite settled on like what it is. I think, in a way, it's too open, it's too abstract, and talks about the kind of philosophical debates around intelligence rather than thinking of it as this like pragmatic thing where we have a responsibility to develop it like responsibly for everyone, to serve the right people. And also there's this idea of like a singular artificial intelligence. I think we've got to stop talking about like AI as if it's this singular thing. Like it's many, many tools that we're talking about there. And in a way it's not really even that like much of an artificial intelligence. It's really a sort of collective or collaborative intelligence with humans. It's kind of hybrid human and computer working together, them doing the big, boring, number-crunching mathematics of data science, and our data, and us sort of telling it how to work through this data. There's a brilliant artist actually called Memo Acton, who made this Chrome extension, which was just like a really lovely sort of archiving, sort of slightly silly, mischievous project, where it was on a Chrome extension, and you downloaded it to your browser, and every time AI or artificial intelligence was mentioned in the news, it would change that to data-driven methods. So like say like Google's new data-driven methods are, you know, replacing jobs. But this thing's like really nice, kind of more pragmatic way of thinking about it. I think, yeah, there's a lot of hype at the moment, a lot of fear about these technologies. I've been working with them for quite a while, so I kind of see it in a slightly different way. I think often, yeah, these ideas of sort of AI consciousness and singularity is a real distraction from the real issues at play here about power and about governance, about who's building these systems and who are they building them for, and what we're choosing to use these technologies for. So in a way, it's sort of containment problem here is like how do we kind of make sure we're using these things in the right direction to serve the right people. And actually, I'm really interested as an artist in flipping the narrative, in thinking about a hopeful future, in thinking about how we can empower ourselves with the technology, and kind of empower often sort of more marginalized communities, or like to do really fun, celebratory, joyful things, rather than often the sort of more dark, dystopic narratives that we get fed about these things. So, I guess, yeah, sort of, as an artist, what really excited me was this concept of computer vision. So it's like, how do we get a computer to start to see and understand the world through images? Which is like a vastly complex task when they kind of started doing these algorithms. They started off by using handwritten letters as like the MNIST data set. So it's like 0 to 9, and just trying to get a computer to recognize the pixels of handwritten numbers. And that's kind of how that started. And they basically invented these things called convolutional neural networks, where it would sort of abstract layers down in a slightly similar way to our brain does. Like our eyes start to look for horizontal lines, it starts to kind of abstract until eventually we get to see like actual whole features like eyes and then a whole face. Effectively, that is kind of how a convolutional neural network is seeing the world. It will kind of look across an image, looking for certain features, and then it will kind of abstract that, and then look for more abstract features and more abstract features until it could correspond to the idea of a human face. So let's say that we've trained a convolutional neural network on 100,000 images of the human face. So this is a facial recognition system, right? And it started to get really, really good at saying, this is an image of a human face, and this isn't an image of a human face. And whenever it gets an image of a human face, it will plot it at a point in space. And this is effectively the output, is 512 numbers, which corresponds to a point in space. And I think this is like a really lovely way of thinking about AI, is actually thinking about it spatially, not so much in terms of it thinking, or it's sort of being conscious or processing things in a linear way. It's sort of doing massive sort of parallel processing on data and then plotting it at a point. So if we say we feed it a new image after it's seen 100,000 images of faces, a new image of a face, it'll say, yeah, that exists at this point, these 512 numbers. And this is something that we call a latent space, right? So everyone with me so far, I realise I'm going quite quick through some theory, but I'm nearly finished with the theory bit. So this idea of a latent space like really, really excited me as an artist. I think sort of conceptually it was so rich and exciting that we could take these huge amounts of data. So one that I was working with back in like 2015 was called ImageNet. And it was 14 million photographs of all sorts of different classes that have been gathered by American engineers. There were big issues with like politics of those data sets, because I think the American engineers building it weren't aware of how loaded some of the labels they were giving images were. So they were like labeling images as terrorist or drug addict. You know, like in those data sets, they weren't really considering the kind of political and ethical implications of that. And that got used as a standard data set for years and years to come by governments, by universities, and the sort of baked in biases. But let's say that all the images of birds are kind of down in that green area, and then you have sort of the images of, I don't know, dolphins, and you have the kind of images of toilet seats kind of moving through this latent space. And if you give it one of those new images, it will plot it at a point, and it will say, because it exists at this 512 dimensional point in a latent space, it probably is an image of I don't know, of a blackbird. And you can think of the same thing with facial recognition. So with 100,000 faces, you can give it a new image of a face. It'll say, it probably exists at this point in a latent space, which could correspond to images of like women in their 30s, or whatever it might be. Now, what I kind of love about this space is that there's a lot of potential. So there's a queer idea of potentiality. There's like in-between spaces, right? So when you kind of say, where these are the images of male faces, these are the images of female faces, there's a whole in-between space. This is like, you know, black faces, white faces. There's, again, a whole in-between where the AI has just reduced things to mathematical probabilities, and you kind of explore that in-between space. So it's only when we give it human labels, or read the human labels out, in a way, that we're kind of classifying, giving it these binaries. But actually, the way that machine learning is working is very debinarized, actually. It's kind of this beautiful, continuous mathematical space. So what you can do is, like I said, this is a 512-dimensional space. You can't actually visualize a 512-dimensional space. It's like pretty impossible to kind of wrap your head around what that might look like. But there's an algorithm to flatten that down to 2 dimensions. So here is a 2-dimensional representation of the IKEA catalogue. So it's an artist called Donald Levin in 2016. I thought it was a really lovely one, so I often show this. You can see there's like office chairs here. I think there's like bins up there, some rugs. So again, it's looking at these images and plotting it in this mathematical space. And then we can kind of say, now, give us a kind of clustering of what exists in what. We can look at museum collections. I think this was 620 museum collections from around the world. Again, like Google massively kind of colonizing our data. And this is a Google Arts project. And it is kind of rather extraordinary, though, to be able to explore, again, this space of all of these museum collections and archives. And it's only understood these artifacts visually from its pixel data, right? So it doesn't know anything about the content or context of those images. It only understands them as that one has a big red circle in it. But again, it can be quite nice to explore that kind of naivety, which a lot of my early work was doing, in kind of how, I don't know, primitive like the AI is looking at our data. This was again sort of another early example. So this was called Word to Vec. This was 3 million words from the English language, plotted in a latent space. You can't see all of them at once, but there are a lot of words in there. So what's amazing here is that you can effectively do the same with words, with language. So you can say, given the whole of Wikipedia and all of the articles off of Reddit, which is what often gets used, common crawl, what words kind of appear commonly next to other words? And from that, the computer can infer, effectively, the meaning of those words, kind of from how and where they appear. And then it can start to plot them in this latent space, which is like a really amazing idea. So you can say, I don't know, take the word London to the word England, and look at the kind of vector between those two words, and then you can do like literally like mathematical, that's really simple, like sort of mathematical like transformation to say to the word France to Paris, and it's literally kind of understood in space that those exist. And then I think there was like a lovely experiment, word to vec bias, where I was looking at the word man to, I don't know, whatever word it might be. They did like lots and lots of experiments. I think, doctor, and then you kind of get the sort of really stupid sort of looking at like the female equivalent would be kind of the synonyms around that space. And actually often it came up with like the same word, but then kind of further down the line, the other words that came up would often be really sexualized or like really reinforce harmful gender stereotypes. So you can kind of look at like bias in language, in space, which I think is like a really extraordinary concept. So it makes you think of like Wittgensteinian language games in a way. It's like actually this like exploring the kind of materiality of language in a space, having been understood by a machine learning algorithm. This is the 512 dimensional point for the word human, which I really love, that this algorithm has just reduced the word human to like a point in space. So the last concept I just wanted to talk about was this idea of creating new images from data sets. So you've probably all like seen these images now being created by like Midjourney and DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, these kind of hyper-realistic AI images. Back when I was working with them, it was kind of, you could create like a tiny little low-resolution image of a thing. And I guess it was like a really interesting moment to be exploring these technologies, because it was constantly kind of failing and getting it wrong and creating really sort of strange, abstract images. This was like a computer scientist, Ian Goodfellow, and his team in 2014 came up with this idea that once you have this latent space and you have these like points in this space, so let's say we've got latent space, trained images of flowers, and you can say, okay, now you've understood all the images of flowers as points in this space. Given this point here, try and create a new image that could have existed in that data set, that never existed in the first place, right? And what effectively is happening is you kind of feed in a second machine learning algorithm that's job is to try and generate new images, starting with noise, and a discriminator network, which is like this one that's been trained on the whole data set that knows what a flower looks like, and it has to try and sort of trick this discriminator into thinking that is a real image that could have existed at that point in a latent space. And it kind of goes through this iterative process and say that's sort of 70% likely to be an image of a flower at that point, and then it's sort of 99% likely to be an image of a flower, until it really does look like it could be a real image. I think it's interesting, this like adversarial network, again, the words that the engineers use, like for me it's much more of a collaborative process rather than like this kind of battle. Also this idea of like realness and fakeness and parsing. I think in queer culture there's like really loaded terms there. That in ballroom culture, this idea of like, you go out and perform executive realness, you go to kind of the ball and you would perform as a cis straight person. I think there's also like and if we're using this with identities and faces, it does become quite loaded. Is it passing for a real human? Actually, I think a lot of my drag project, I really wanted to subvert that, like really train it on faces that didn't get recognized, and sort of broke down this system in between the kind of real and fake space. It also makes like complete sense to me that Alan Turing would come up with a whole philosophical thought experiment all about this idea of like passing, as someone who constantly had to be performing as a straight man in 1930s Britain, that this idea of kind of a computer passing for kind of human realness sort of all feels quite connected to me. Anyway, so one of the first experiments, obviously I had to generate electric sheep to reference Philip K. Dick. This is like one of my first experiments with an early AI generator, synthesizing, so that was back in 2016, trying to create images of electric sheep. And I think so this was from ImageNet, so these 14 million images, and it would take kind of, so I'm not from a computer science background, but I was always kind of hacking, but just the setup for this thing, like the amount of kind of software I had to install on my computer that would just sort of constantly be breaking things, was a bit of a nightmare. But I was taking open source code kind of being released from research labs in America and kind of playing with them and seeing what they could do. So one of the first pieces that I created was a reference to this piece. Do people know this piece? Hands if you do. It's one of my favorites. So it's amazing. Deepfake, who made this piece, which is a Buddha looking at its reflection mediated through a CCTV feed. So it's kind of this like really beautiful Zen feedback loop mediated through technology, made by the kind of godfather of video art. And me and a collaborator in Berlin created an auto-encoded Buddha. So this effectively was getting a Buddha to look at its reflection mediated through kind of an AI in its infancy, really, one of the earliest image generator networks, but completely failed to create a representational image of the Buddha. Partly because we didn't have enough data in our data sets, we didn't have powerful enough computers to train it, but there became a real poetry in seeing the kind of failure of this technology. So this is the kind of thing that it created. Let me just remember I have a ticker. I don't actually need to be leaning back and forth every time. So here are some of the kind of, abstract artifacts, if you like, the kind of guts of this neural network, not really able to settle on an image of Buddha, so hadn't kind of learned from the images. So following on from that, this is a piece called Latent Space. And effectively, what this work is doing is it's going on a kind of walk through a latent space, again trained on 14 million images, like I said, from an ImageNet dataset. But instead of getting it to settle on an electric sheep or an image of Buddha, I just told it to just move through the space and not really give it time to the generator really have time to try and get to the perfect image of whatever class or object it might be in that point in latent space. Instead, just kind of skirt through it quite superficially. And what it revealed was something really beautiful and abstract. Effectively, it kind of learned from how humans take photographs of the world, right? Kind of learned about form, it learned about color, it learned sort of often horizon lines, rules of thirds, because obviously it's humans that took the photographs that this algorithm was trained on. It kind of did pick up tropes of how we experience and see the world, but sort of really reduced to these like AI artifacts. So I showed this at art school actually, alongside a lot of paintings. I think people were quite struck by how close it is to abstract expressionism and kind of doing something, I think, quite uncanny in a way. But I've never been interested in this idea of an AI taking over from the human artist. I think for me it's always been a kind of collaborative exercise, like sort of using it as a tool and sort of getting it to ask these questions and getting people to think about it more. But ultimately for me, I think the idea that it's going to take over from like making art for the sake of art doesn't make any sense, because like for me as an artist, I make art because I have to make art. That's what I do to express myself, to express things that we can't really express in any other way. So an AI has no intentionality, it has no reason for doing that. But I think, I am worried for more applied arts, where these things can create outputs much faster and cheaper than human labour. So we do definitely need a lot of policy legislation right now to protect artists and makers. It's also sad that a lot of the engineers seem to be like going for kind of musicians and artists first. It's like, it just seems bad, like why can't they go for like accounting and, you know, things that we don't necessarily want to be doing? And you know, there's a quote about, yeah, why can't we get it to do our laundry for us? Why does it have to be taking over from my art making, my music making? And it's true. And I think in a way it's, you know, it's often, it's a money thing, it's about getting publicity and press. It's the engineers can impress everyone if they can kind of create an algorithm that can do something that we think is so solely human. Of course, they could be focusing on lots of other tasks, but I think they know that they'll get more attention and funding if they kind of show they can be a wonderful painter. But I don't think it's very useful for humanity, and I think it kind of leaves us with far less things to do in the future. But I'm hoping that we can move towards a place where we will start to really value art for art making's purpose in itself, and yeah, and care and education. Anyway, thank you. So yeah, that piece showed on like the largest LED screen under Canary Wharf, which is quite fun. So kind of looked up into like Canary Wharf and kind of saw the guts of this AI working. This one was quite fun. So this is sort of subverting and querying an AI that was created to censor pornography from Yahoo's algorithm. Now, I never actually saw the images it was trained on. I was just able to download the model that had been trained on these images. So it's kind of the latent space, the representation of these images without the images itself. And back-end, like, reverse engineer it to create the most pornographic porn from the computer's perspective. So here are the images that it created. Which again are really not that explicit, but they're kind of quite strange. Like, they definitely have a sort of feeling of genitalia. Quite interesting for me as well, that like Yahoo's algorithm just focused in on the genitals. That's what it's really looking for, is kind of work out how explicit images are. But also what's interesting for me here is that this is an example of unsupervised deep learning. So when I mentioned before, if we don't give it the labels going in, then in a way AI is inherently kind of queer, debinarized. So no one sat down and said, oh, this is an image of a dick, and this is an image of a vagina. It's always in between, right? So all of these images, in a way, are kind of intersex images, sort of constantly morphing between the yonic and the phallic. So there's kind of, yeah, exploring this quite interesting queerness of that machine learning porn. There's actually, I worked with a DJ who kind of created a whole piece, a track for this video. You can watch it on their website, actually, and it's narrated by the first non-binary, sort of gender-neutral voice that was created by Copenhagen Pride to try and remove some of the harmful gender stereotypes around sort of having female or male voice assistants, if we can create a kind of in-between gender-neutral voice. So it sort of talks about how this work was made with a sort of techno track. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about a couple of other pieces before getting onto my drag piece. So this work was again kind of about recontextualizing or subverting these technologies and effectively creating marsh birds. So since I was a little kid, I've been going to the Essex marshes, and it's the most, I think, one of the richest areas of biodiversity of marsh and wading birds in the country. So I trained it on a data set of marsh birds, of wading birds, and effectively took these images out into the mud. So there's me going with a projection screen, kind of planting this in the mud. And the idea was kind of having the most cutting edge technology at the time, sitting with something as ancient and kind of primitive as like these mineral rich mud flats with the real birds behind them, having this kind of dialogue. So I'll play a little bit of that. You can kind of see, here's the... All the sounds also were generated from 10 hours of field recordings. You can see the red piece up behind this bird. What was quite interesting as well for me was that, so you can see it's moving again through the second space of kind of into bits of different birds. It's kind of got the leg of an oyster catcher, and then you might see the sort of beak of a curlew. It constantly shifts in form, but because it's like, again, sort of AI in infancy trying to recognize birds, it wasn't very good at it. As you can see, when a bird is kind of trying to do more front on, it gets really confused. And it's really interesting for me because actually in the data there are loads of images of birds facing the camera, of birds in flight, of multiple birds even, and it just focused on doing a single bird in profile, which wasn't something I kind of explicitly told it to do. And for me that's a reminiscent of like cave painting, but actually as humans the way that we were trying to understand the natural world was through painting individual animals in profile, and that's similar to how this neural network was trying to understand the form of the bird. So this showed in the Natural History Museum in Berlin, which was quite fun. Lots of stuffed birds. And it's showing in China and Finland, I think, as well. So here was another early experiment. So this was, again, so the latent space piece that I mentioned, moving through this model. So there's actually a research group called Evolving AI at the University of Wyoming, who kind of created this very first image generator algorithm that I was experimenting with in 2016. And I think sort of in the third iteration, one of the engineers realized that instead of just starting with a point in latent space to create your image, which could correspond to where the birds exist, you could actually seed it with a whole sentence, so pair it with another AI, which does language processing, and use a sentence as your point in space. So this is kind of like 6 years or so before now what we have prompting, so I don't know how many people here have been generating AI images and you sort of type into it. But back then it wasn't like that at all, so actually this was kind of quite an early experiment with working with language. So the idea was that this is trying to create an image of a blue light on the wall, and then it will say what it sees in that image. So that's seeing a yellow frisbee in the air. It labels what it sees in the image. And then that label for the previous image becomes the input for the next one. So it's kind of stuck in this, again, constant feedback loop where they're in conversation with each other. It often gets stuck in cat loops, because there are so many cats in the data set, which I quite liked. We got a cat in the photo. Very squished cat. So I'll show you quickly a little bit of this work as well. I think this is the last one before I'm going to move on to there's one other one. So this piece is a more recent work. So actually I haven't got that involved in a lot of these new AI models. I think for me, I really loved it. Kind of maybe sort of a lot of the technology from 4 or 5 years ago, which is what I'm still using now, where you kind of, I felt more like I was playing with this tool and kind of could, I don't know, experiment with the materiality of the code itself and actually kind of understand how it's all working, kind of train on my own data, and I really enjoyed that whole process. And I think now, in a way, it's so beholden to big tech that we're using these AI models where they've gathered the data, they've trained the model, you're kind of just using this like web interface or something, and it doesn't, to me, really feel like I'm engaging with it as my own artistic material quite in the same way. But I did kind of do a little art theory experiment joke with this technology. So this is effectively getting these kind of big AI models that exist now to interpret Susan Sontag's seminal essay Against Interpretation. I just thought there was like something really silly about getting an AI to interpret Against Interpretation. It's actually an AI interpreting an AI's interpretation of Against Interpretation. Because we have like a language model which interprets an image. So effectively what we have is we have a line of Susan Sontag, and it will create an image from that as kind of its prompt, and then it will say what it sees in that image. And often it came up like really sort of polemic, quite, I don't know, aggressive, argumentative statements, which I thought was kind of hilarious, but really did show how kind of biased and dark this AI can get. It's sort of seeing swastikas and things and stuff. So I'll play a second of that. Oh.
Once upon a time when high art was scarce. The painting depicts a Western artist's lack of imagination. It must have been a revolutionary and creative move to interpret works of art. What does Michelangelo do when he doesn't want to paint? No, it is not. is no art.
Last one. So yeah, it's kind of quite fun. But again, also like the sometimes words for me feel so kind of like very, very kind of interesting when sort of reframed with AI, sort of thinking about kind of form and content, and actually how a lot of these, you know, AIs are devoid of content, they're devoid of kind of a human, like, any human meaning, any human intentionality. So kind of how do we read kind of the artist's, you know, intention into something that is just pure mimesis, is kind of something that is, yeah, creating the kind of most generic image based on a data set of human data, but again, there's no human to be read into, so it's kind of doing this very interesting thing. In a way, it kind of moves quite close to something. It's kind of this pure form, but obviously we're kind of doing this like slightly cheeky Derrida move of like interpreting her words. Anyway, this piece is called Dada Data. So this is the last piece I want to quickly show you before moving on to the AI drag, slightly aware of time as well. But effectively, this work is kind of trying to think a little bit about who's building these systems and who are they building them for, right? So it's kind of, again, like a slightly silly piece where I'm turning the AI around on the actual people who are building them. So rather than thinking of this stuff as abstract data in the sky, let's think of this thing as real people. So I took I think Forbes list of the most influential tech CEOs, who pretty much all white men in America, I think, with the exception of Jack Ma, and effectively using an AI to get them to just speak in numbers, in the order they said them. So I'll play a little extract of this.
Tens of millions, hundreds of millions, 1 billion, million, 500 billion, 200,
5, 10,000, 1 billion, million, 100 million, 2 billion, 1, 200.
9. Thousands, 120, billionaire, hundreds of billions of 2, hundreds of billions of 24/7.
Trillions of 3 trillion, 2 million, 500 billion, 50 billion, 64, 55.
100 million, 11, 17 million, 4 billion, 1 billion, 100 million.
15, 100, 110 millions, 5, 4, 5, 6, 4, 1, 6, 7, 8, 9, 5,000.
So there we go. So, yeah, now I'm going to speak a little bit about kind of how we're querying this process. So that last piece, it was like removing everything that wasn't a number, effectively. You probably guessed that. But those are actually the numbers they said in the order they said them, which is quite fun. I did experiment with it counting up, but I think actually kind of leaving it with the natural voice progression of getting excited. Okay, yes. So I want to speak a little bit about the Deepfake Drag project. I don't have as much time, but I'll kind of whiz through some of it. So this piece effectively started back in 2019, StyleGAN. So these are all fake faces, these are all points in a latent space. Now they're quite normative faces, right? The data sets that were being used, the first data set was literally just trained on American celebrities. That's what they had royalty-free images of. And you can imagine there was a big issue of bias there. Then they started taking images from Flickr. Again, it kind of became this strange kind of internet colonial quest of like, images tagged with in an African village but taken by an American tourist, and kind of became this, again, quite sticky with the data. So these are all points in a latent space. Now my idea was to effectively inject images of drag. Now the reason I want to use drag is because for me, drag, I'm part of the London drag scene, my boyfriend runs drag shows. Drag is kind of the ultimate form of gender nonconformity. But it's also something that's really playful and accessible and performative. And it also has this kind of interesting thing that it's about constructed identity. And with AI, we also have a lot of layers of artifice and construction. So to kind of inject images of people celebrating otherness, celebrating moving away from normativity into this data set. So we go from these images, which train 70,000 images of faces. I've then injected 1,000 images of drag kings, drag queens, drag things, moving away from just gay men doing female impersonation and kind of really expanding the bracket of drag performance. And it shifts from these points in latent space to these points. So it's kind of broken down what a face is. It's shifted the weights in this neural network from a place of normativity into this kind of place of otherness and queerness. So we can move through this space and kind of see how this face is kind of constantly breaking down and getting confused. I've got a few more here. So the next step after this was to think about how we could get this thing to actually perform, and about how we could work with local drag performers to kind of get this thing to lip sync us to Shirley Bassey's song or Beyonce's song, right? Because I have no control over this right now. I can just kind of move this point through a latent space. So the technique that we used was deepfakes, right? So this is effectively similar to what I was talking about before, this idea of a generative adversarial network, but instead of starting at a random point in latent space, and then starting with noise and trying to create an image, we start with a label, and in our case that is a skeleton. So we can kind of feed the AI a skeleton, and it will create us a new deepfake image of our body doing that movement. So the way that we did this, we kind of, in lockdown actually, we filmed 21 drag performers from the London scene in, I think, queer venues closed because of lockdown. And then we turned each of the frames into a skeleton. So this is video footage of Lily Snatch Dragon walking around for 3 minutes. That was our data set. We created a second data set of the skeleton, effectively. And then the AI process starts, where effectively this is the machine learning kind of generated image. It doesn't see the top left image. All it gets to see is the skeleton, and it has to try and create an image as close to the top left, just being given a kind of accuracy score. So effectively it's sort of telling it, oh yeah, you're 99% close to the original image now. This sort of takes 3 weeks on a computer at the end of my bed. And then we have kind of the training of Lily Snatch Dragon. At this point, we can move in, we can basically like feed in any new movement, and we can see Lily Snatch Dragon performing as me, the drag queen. It was really important for us that not anyone could then come and perform as Lily Snatch Dragon, so we really want to think about like the ethics of deepfakes. How do we do them consensually, right? It's such a hot topic, and actually we were kind of exploring this like 4 years before Equity and the actors unions and things were discussing this, but we wanted to make sure that all of our drag performers knew what they were getting into, what a deepfake was, so a lot of them weren't familiar at the time. We wanted to make sure that they got paid for their data, that they can withdraw their data. Every time the project gets shown, they get a cut of exhibition fees. And most importantly, in a way, was that not anyone could come and re-puppet the body of a drag performer, because that felt really kind of fascistic and dark to us. The only people who had the right to like reanimate each other's bodies were from our community, were people doing lip syncs. So I'm just wondering which one to leave it on. Here's a little bit of footage of me, the drag queen, kind of doing movement for us. We have a little bit of, I think this was Caramel doing a little bit of movement, as is the sister. Now, I'm just wondering, I'm not going to play this whole one, it's slightly long. I'll show you a second of this bit. So this one was one of my favourite instances in the project. And this is a moment where the AI failed, right? So this is kind of like the queer art of failure. This is seeing 21 drag bodies break an AI system, because it never saw any of our performers drop into the splits, right? So when Caramel came along and dropped into the splits, it effectively broke the AI system. It didn't really know what to do with that, right? It was outside of the latent space, outside of the data it learned from, in the same way that like a black trans person who's not recognized by facial recognition systems kind of exists as a data point outside of what it's learned, outside of the latent space. So if it doesn't understand what to do when someone falls into the splits, it breaks. So this showed for a year at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Yeah, I think, shall I finish there? Oh, well, actually, okay, well, no, I think maybe we should open it to questions. Otherwise we'll run out of time for questions. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, well done. You made it to the last session of the second day of the Harvest Conference. It's great to see you here. I hope you've had an enjoyable couple of days so far. We're going to finish off our day with a kind of a conversation and an exploration, I suppose, into environment and see how various different aspects of artistic practice can dabble and explore around the edges of AI. And we're very pleased to welcome Raphael Klein here to the Elwes 2024 conference. Raphael is a New York artist, or is it a London artist?
Bi-coastal now, yeah.
A transatlantic artist.
Transatlantic.
Raphael, born in New York, and came over, attracted by the London winters, to London. And while you were here, I believe, Raphael, you were feeling a bit homesick and keen to get back to New York.
That's right, yeah.
And so one of your first artist books was a comic book, graphic novel,
Yeah.
which you created to fund your flight back.
That's right. And because I was taken with the local culture, it was based on Punch and Judy. And it's the unexpurgated Punch and Judy. So I've basically been, in this country, I've mostly been working as a public artist, working on public sculptures. And when Jerry speaks of environment, I'm very interested in the sense of place. And this is a sculpture I've just finished literally 2 weeks ago. It's in an area called Angel Edginton. And one of the things I love to do on the public sculptures is to get creative workshops together with local people. Because since I'm creating something which is going to be create a sense of identity for a particular environment, it's very useful for me to work with people and find what they feel about their local place and to incorporate. And so if you see the shape of the angel is from my idea about the Angel Edginton, a way to express the area. And if you look at the, this is a short video, which, hi, could we just run through this just to see, because you can get a better sense of how I've incorporated other people's artwork into the final sculpture. You can see all this detail within are based on models of people who've done workshops. They're people's responses to the area and also to the idea of angel. So you can see lots of words, purity, silver, etc. And basically the local train station is called Silver Street. So you see the word silver in there, etc. So this has been the my main activity. When I was in New York, I was also very concerned with place, and the times most of my work is about in this period is in the early 80s in New York. It was very rough, very difficult time in New York. And these are two views from my apartment on 13th Street. This is the street, and that is the view outside my window. And this was one of the first artist books I made. It's called Tales of New York. While I was studying at the Art Students League, I drove a cab to make money. And it was that iconic time, like Martin Scorsese, Eat Your Heart Out. It was a very, very edgy time. And in terms of sense of place, if you drive a cab in New York in the evening, you do get a sense of what the place is like. These are just some sketches I did on the subway. And one of the things I've done is because it came about in an interesting way is that somebody, the Tate acquired this little book, Tales of New York, and somebody saw it there, a woman called Caroline Gardner, and asked if she could pay for me to go back to New York and relive a bit of the excitement of being a cab driver in this period. And this is the film that she made, a very short section of it. Can you please forward that?
In my taxi cab, Tales of New York. When I was going to art school, I needed to find a way to make money to support myself. Why don't you drive a taxi a few nights a week, said my grandpa. I can make $400 or $500 driving only on the weekends. But you have to be a bit of a hustler. There were plenty of ways to cheat at cab driving. There was the trick of only booking half your fares on the meter, pocketing the rest. The fare would normally cost about $4. I'll do it for a flat $3 with no tip, if you don't mind me not putting it on the meter. Sure, they'd usually say. Everyone in New York appreciates a hustle. People in my cab acted as if they were in their own home. All with a casual, relaxed attitude. At the end of a long Saturday night, you really felt you had a sense of what kind of vibe was out on the street. You were supposed to keep your doors locked and never take anyone uptown. But I was reckless and naive. On a cold night up in Harlem, I was waiting for a red light when a young kid came up to my window and said, "Please, man, can you just drop me down on 112th Street? I got no money. You're on your way downtown anyway." I said, "Hop in." And then he shoved his pistol between the crude bulletproof shield in my seat. He directed me to an abandoned building on some bombed-out Harlem street. He acted like all the cops who had ever busted him must have done. He had me leaning on my cab, spread-eagled, while he threatened to shoot me. He took my money, but thankfully left me my cab. I took another fare on my way back to the garage so I'd have little change to see me home.
So that was a film that Caroline Gardner made based on Tales of New York.
So yeah, Raphael, that's I think that's the piece that I was introduced to you with many years ago, and I was wondering when you were obviously it's the real life experience as an art student trying to get by, the hustle of it, the edginess of the environment you were in, and but I wonder, would you speak to the way that the comic book worked into the film, and you know how, because I think with your work you seem to move across different practice, sculpture, painting,
that's true,
bookmaking. This
is my cross to bear. The USP is hard to define, but I think basically what unites it is this the desire to create a story about the sense of place. Stories we all tell, and some, particularly because I come from Coney Island, which is a very iconic place in Brooklyn. I've always been very aware of the fact that places they exist in stories, and that the places are defined by stories, and sometimes we don't actually see the place. We're more aware of the iconography or the mythology of the place. But yeah, that was the first time I had the opportunity to see how a book of mine could be reaching a wider group of people, because when you do artist books, compared to doing a public sculpture is there, it's in permanence, it creates a new sense of an identity for an area. The artist books, they end up in collections, which is great. But we were just looking at the collection here at the CSM, and it was mentioned that nobody seems to know how you research it, how you find books. You can't just browse. You need to know the book exists. You have to search it. So the films became a natural way to reach a wider audience, to make the books open out of it. So yeah. So I've continued with that. That film was made by Caroline Gardner, and then I made a very short film based on a visit I took down to Florida. My parents moved to Florida, and I stayed in Manhattan on my own. And I was kind of shocked by the environmental destruction of Florida, and the strip malls and the endless developments. It just seemed very chaotic, and under the surface was all this wonderful nature. It felt as if this is kind of a brutality, a form of aggression against the nature. And so I made a short film called, well, first I wrote this book, which is called Florida, or You Can't Fight Progress. And one of the things I use in my books very often is these pop-ups and fold-outs and pages that make you complicit in the development of the natural world of Florida. And again, I made a short film about Florida. It's called, I'm wondering if there's any sound on this. It has quite a biblical tone. And in the book, I've got cutouts and paste-ups, and I've tried to recreate that. And I realized the collage elements work quite well in the film medium. So I've translated them into in the book, when you go through the pages and open the flaps and actually destroy the nature of Florida, it makes you complicit, and that's the idea.
For me, I think, Raphael, this work particularly speaks to, and we've spoken about this before, about the pressure that we're putting on our natural environment. And one of the themes that have been coming up over the last 2 days, which you may have picked up on, is the pressure that AI and the data centers are putting on, the environment in places all around the world.
Yeah, well, especially right now when there's this hysteria and it's such an incredible amount of money. Well, there's the expectation of all of us becoming incredibly wealthy as a result of AI, and therefore a limitless amount of server farms and data centers, and it's kind of hopefully there will be a benefit to justify this incredible cost to the environment. Yeah.
So do you feel that this situation that's developing will influence, or how will it play with the way you engage in a more traditional artistic practice?
Yes,
if I could push you in that direction.
Well, it's true. I do feel like I'm a little bit out of place a little bit in an AI conference, but basically I think of it as a tool. And one of the reasons I think that you invited me to show some of my films and books here is because I have now started to use it, and I've used it in the most recent book and film that I've done. And that it's very useful, I think, and it does create a sense of. But on the other hand, I think because of the hysteria, because of the. On the one hand, we think of it as the apocalypse, it's the end of the world. Not only will it destroy the world, but nobody will be bothered to create any original content on the web because everything will be scraped and available via one of these chatbots. And I think, it's probably neither one nor the other. I think with a lot of these new developments, there's a period of time when things get very frenetic. And now NVIDIA is suddenly the wealthiest and most valuable company on earth. Things will taper off, I think, and become a little more sensible, I hope. Let me just jump to another film. Another book, actually. I had the pleasure to work with a homelessness charity, which was quite an important experience for me because being obsessed with this idea of a sense of place and how people feel about where they live, you tend to think of homelessness as people without a sense of place, without any real place, in a kind of an empty world. And with Thames Reach, we created a book which is called Home Truths. And in addition to a book, we managed to make a large sculpture in which there are levels of people's ideas of home as flats within the sculpture. And eventually we made a short film.
My London is huge. I don't know, it's just like one great big hotel. When I was in the street, I didn't have to consider, what do I do today? It was just a matter of get up and do things. Whereas now, not only do I have to get up and kick myself to do something, but I also have to consider what it is I'm kicking myself to do. I've slept in that many doorways, Soho, up through the Strand, Southend, Leeds. I remember the first night I actually laid down in the street, seeing on the side angle all these feet going past me. Thousands of feet just walking past, and I thought, I've never seen the world from this angle. It's really not easy to have a relationship in the street, and there are certain aspects, obviously, that just don't work with living up. Things like having sex and just keeping up a general appearance for your partner and things like this. It's very hard to run a relationship in the street. As anyone who's ever tried will tell you. I think that was probably a very big turning point in my decision to actually get somewhere to live. When I first became homeless, I really enjoyed myself. I found it very liberating. I was very free, but I was very young, and I was very intrigued by the whole lifestyle, by the whole do as you please, pick up and go, nobody asks you any questions. I wouldn't go back there. I don't think it's anything healthy.
The first Christmas, there was actually, the postman delivered a card that was addressed to the Lady of the Steps, Grafton Street. That was my little posh boss's leaflet.
She was a feature of the neighbourhood. How many umbrellas did you have? Three umbrellas. It got pretty cold, it got pretty wet.
On my last night on the street, I actually slept behind the boarding, and then in the morning, Thames Reach came and with the taxi and took all my bits and pieces away. On the street, I just worked very hard to keep my own normality. You never completely sleep. There's a little thing inside your head that's just tuned. It's a very animal thing that you're just tuned into danger. And there's the noise, there's the traffic, there's people partying, there's glasses breaking, there's buses going. You're catnapping, highly tense, highly tuned into things. You start getting jangly. I mean, I never not wanted to have somewhere to live, but suddenly it falls and in a very regimented system, which it has to be. I discovered my birth certificate no longer existed, so I didn't exist.
So that was Home Truths, which, it was a very interesting experience for me, and we did make another sculpture finally for the head office of Thames Reach.
What does strike me is you talk about a sense of place and this appears very clearly in your work, as you've demonstrated there. But the New York Tales, Florida, the homelessness, and it got me thinking about sort of this a sense of place for AI, because what I sort of struck me in listening to various talks over the last couple of days is it sitting in art? Is it sitting in computer science? Do you go to the library for it? And where is that place where we meet it? Or can we meet it anywhere?
It does.
Is it an itinerant thing?
It does seem as if it is a place. Yeah, it's a place to go to. But as I say, for me, it does seem it's a tool. It's another. And as you say, I work in a lot of different media, and in particular, the most recent book I did was about a place that I've never lived in, but prior to this book, I spent about 18 months doing a book about my own background, my grandparents' background in Poland before the Second World War, and how they were affected by the Holocaust, etc. And so I felt I felt a bit consumed with this idea of Poland as a place and as a war-torn country. And then war broke out on a neighboring country to Poland, and I really felt I wanted to do something to work on that theme. And I realized I didn't know the place. I read several books on the history of Ukraine, and I really didn't know how to develop an idea for an artist book, because it's not something as personal as Coney Island or Florida. And so I turned to AI, and in terms of the imagery, and I'll show you now a short film that I made. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to read the text of the book alongside the film. It's called Moth and the Flame, and I've used the AI. Well, you'll probably be able to tell, maybe you won't, what imagery and what thoughts come from AI. Can we run the Moth and the Flame?
You need to switch the slide.
Sorry?
I think you need to switch the slide.
So it's not it? Oh, sorry. The Moth and the Flame. Moths and butterflies belong to the same family. They should get along. But sometimes they don't. They both perform an amazing transformation, starting as a caterpillar and forming a cocoon when they're ready to grow wings and fly. The butterfly loves the warmth of the sun and is active all day. The moth is a night creature and prefers the dark. Butterflies pull nectar from flowers, while moths live on a liquid diet of rotting fruit, bird droppings, and sap. The biggest difference between butterflies and moths is that a moth emerging from its cocoon is a dull gray and brown color, while the butterfly is known for its bright, colorful wings. There was once a family of butterflies whose neighbors, moths who hated colors, oppressed them, starving them, and they suffered a terrible famine. They lost their love of color. Then one day, the butterflies discovered color again. At first just one, and soon a movement formed. But there was one moth who didn't like this and wanted to end it. He was Big Moth. And like all moths, he loved flames. He wished those butterflies were still frightened of color. Any moths who disagreed with him were silenced. Big Moth even woke his secret army to ask for help. Together, they brought flames and destruction to the butterflies. You see what your love of colors has brought you? Wouldn't it have been better to have accepted your colorless lives? But then all the moths finally woke up to Big Moth's madness and lies and decided they had enough of senseless war and revolted. Or then the secret army finally turned on Big Moth and tore him to pieces. Or then, all the freedom-loving people in the world eventually captured Big Moth, and he was imprisoned as a despised war criminal. Or then, Big Moth won the war and spread the regime of hateful lies. However, when he died, he was sent forever to the seventh circle of hell. Or then, the butterflies prevailed and rejoiced in their freedom. So that's the moth and the flame. And one of the reasons I did it was because I wanted to contribute something, and I've managed to send well over £1,000 to the Disaster Emergency Committee through the sales of the book and prints related. So it gave me a way. But one of the things about AI was it gave me a way, a tool that I could, from an abstract point of view, find a way into that dilemma.
Thank you so much, Raphael. I'm very aware that time is against us, so if it's okay with you, it'd be great to open it up to the audience and give people an opportunity to ask you questions rather than I.
Yeah, sure. Are there any questions?
Any questions for Raphael?
Well, that's simple. We should go to another film. Shall I just...
There's one now.
Yeah.
I just wondered if the process of making the collages and like the videos that you've made, has it changed then, like with the use of AI, or is it a very similar process? Like, how did you make the earlier?
Well, what I've done is, as anyone could do, I would go to DALL-E and type in a prompt, and once I've generated some imagery, then I would begin to draw and collage and build up my own image based on what was, and of course choosing the images. And one of the other things that was very useful is because I really couldn't imagine an end to this particular story. It does seem a bit endless. And when I asked ChatGPT what is the ending of the Ukraine war, it was very similar to my own instinct, which was, there are many endings. They gave me many.
Any more? Eleanor.
I was just wondering about you said your other works were very personal to you in the places that they were, and this one obviously wasn't quite as personal, though obviously you were emotionally concerned about it. But I wondered about how you found that actually making a work that wasn't based on a physical place where you had I suppose I'm thinking of the kind of other sensory inputs that come when you're in a place, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, and the memories as well, that obviously have been very important in your previous works. And I don't know, just how you found that process really when you didn't have that material at hand.
Yes, I think it's interesting because as an artist, I think I'm very instinctual and as you say, quite traditional in terms of my use of materials, painting and drawing. And in terms of the theme, the overriding theme, it's only revealed itself to me over time. This idea that my work is all about stories we tell about places. And when this particular war broke out, it was that thing, this idea that someone, Big Moth in this case, would have a very specific idea about a place, and that if it didn't fit with reality, it would lead to war. It was something quite, and there is the connection personally, of course, is because I had spent 18 months reading and studying about what happened to my own family in war, and imagining this kind of thing of storytelling about place. Somebody trying to recreate a myth that they have in their head about a place and how it led to war. It brought back all of the the research I had done. It was quite personal, the research, but it was also necessary to go back historically because, as you probably know, people who've lived through this kind of tragedy are famously reticent about talking about it. The silence of people who've survived the Holocaust is well known. And so a lot of the things I never knew before. I didn't even know that my grandparents were in Poland, in a town called Łomża. And when I could research what happened in Łomża, it became much more real for me. And so being so steeped in war that touches my family and touches me, when I started to see all this tragedy on the television screen night after night, continuing to this day, it was personal, I think.
Gentleman back.
Do you think that being a member of a diaspora group informed your attachment to a sense of psychogeography and place in your artistic work?
Yes, definitely, I think. And much more so now than when I began working. I think it's something that's grown with age, this realization how much I've always carried. And I guess also a sense of rootlessness, a sense of not really belonging, the fact that I found it relatively easy to become an expatriate and live in another country. And yes, I think a lot of that, it started to reveal itself to me only recently, this idea that being part of a diaspora is it's in my genes, It's been recently reminded to me by the NHS, who have discovered that there's a gene that some of us carry, which leads to not unlike other genetic groups of people, and they've sent me a test to see if I carry this particular gene. So it's something that it's revealing itself to me more and more now. Yes. Sadly, I haven't brought the film and the book relating to this because, well, obviously now we're living through a time when she was on the other foot, when, the war that's going on in Gaza is just something I'd rather not even enter into at this point.
Thank you so much, Raphael. I don't know, do you have another film?
I would love to do. Does anyone want to see a film? Can I do another film? I'd like to do one that I read to. There's one that's about Coney Island.
Oh, this is great, yeah.
Which, I think you've seen. I've read this at the British Library, and it's a little bit, thank goodness, a bit lighter than what we've been talking about. I'll cue it for you, sorry. Let's see. These are some other books which relate to short films. This is another short film. Unfortunately, we haven't had a chance to see it. This is another book of mine. It's quite a lot we haven't actually seen. So this is the book. It's called Coney Island, and that's a page from the book and one of the sculptures that relates to Coney Island. And I think we need a little more sound, possibly. Okay, we're running. Coney Island. Thank you.
I'm just trying to see if there's a film on it.
Have you found it yet?
No, I have not.
It should be there. It should be there. I love technology, really. I'm actually quite interested in technology, especially when it works. Can we stop it for just 1 minute, please? Because I don't seem to have the text for it. I apologize to you all. I know you've had a very long day. Can we review it to the beginning? I love technology. Once I was in Coney Island with my parents. And it was That's right. It was a steaming August afternoon. The cyclone was the big attraction. The wood supports bending and squealing under the strain of the steel wheels made a terrific thunder. And in the middle of the stomach-churning ride was Nathan's, famous for the best hot dogs on earth, and not just hot dogs, but also corn on the cob, hot pastrami, Chinese egg rolls, clams on the half shell, and the wonderful crinkle-cut French fries served in a paper cup with a wooden fork. It was all family entertainment, except in places where the weirdness tipped the balance, like the barkers outside the freak shows, enticing you to come in and see the bearded lady and serpent man, the Siamese twins. The shows might have been disappointing, with the beard on the lady obviously stuck on, but that took nothing away from the chilling weirdness of it all. And then there was the Wax Museum of Horrors. Inside, there were a few baseball heroes like Babe Ruth, but the things that got interesting were the axe murderers and tableaus of every social deviant and homicidal lunatic imaginable. The crudeness of the displays added to the horror, satisfying the crowd's morbid curiosity. And then there were the rides. There was the chilling and decrepit haunted house, with the animated head of a dragon outside, swaying slowly from side to side and closing its mouth and opening it to reveal a flame inside. I was transfixed in front of this puppet. All the sights and sounds around me slipped into soft focus. The large dragon's head was the only thing that seemed real to me. And when I snapped out of my reverie, I realized that the rest of my family was gone, leaving me standing alone in front of the dragon. And I continued walking. Where should I run to, with nothing but strangers in every direction? Walking aimlessly, I came to an immense glass palace, surrounded by a roller coaster in the shape of a horse race. Wooden horses were chasing in and out of the building all along the roof of the thing. The entire place seemed to be in the shape of a big, goofy, laughing face. And across the entrance was a sign that read Steeplechase, the funny place. People had discs around their neck with circles running around, and they had holes punched in when they got on a ride. In order to enter, you had to pass through an enormous barrel. This barrel was revolving, and people were sliding and stumbling over each other, trying to get to the other end. A young child on his own wasn't noticed, and so I wandered into the large tube and began to slip and slide. Holding on to the sides didn't work, it just meant you would rotate with the tube. And then when you would let go, you'd painfully hit the bottom. There were practical jokes everywhere. A stack of children's blocks, 30 feet high, wobbled as you went past. Hidden jets of air blew the women's skirts up over their heads as they walked past. And there was a man who controlled all of these jokes, sitting up on top of a giant elephant. Like the Wizard of Oz, he sent little shocks through metal handrails as people climbed the staircase. He triggered sliding sections of floor, making people slip over. And then there was the steeplechase ride itself. Above me, I could hear the rumbling of the mechanical horse race galloping around us on the roof. I walked into a theater, and I sat down in the auditorium. The stage was empty. Suddenly on the stage, people appeared. They were coming off the horse ride. Still dizzy, they were shocked to see they were on a stage in front of an audience. And then the floor they walked on started to shift, making them stumble. It was that controller in the elephant again. Onto the stage walked a clown. But I noticed this clown had an electric prod. He poked people with it, and they jumped 10 feet, delighting the audience. And all the while, above us, the steeplechase ride continued. Very soon, more unsuspecting people would be dumped onto this stage. where were my parents? I left the theater, wandered outside, and I saw the strangest rides. People spinning around on a human billiard table. People high on a parachute jump. Everything seemed so scary. I had that lost little boy feeling again. I wanted to get back to my family. I was late to a room where I waited for my parents. Everyone was very nice to me and bought me an ice cream. I don't remember being reunited with my family. Sometimes it seems to me that I never was, and was adopted by that dragon in Coney Island.
Thank you so much. Thank you again. I'm afraid that sort of brings us to the end of this session. So thank you so much. I was really struck by hearing how you've adopted AI and weaved it into this well-established multidisciplinary practice. So
Well,
thank you
that's my
so
feeling. Why not? You know, rather than being a victim of it, let's, you know, I do think it'll be a very useful tool, and hopefully it won't make us all, put us all in the scrap heap.
I'm sure it won't. It certainly won't put you on the scrap. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Raphael.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you.